Hello, thank you, and welcome to our trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming voting webinar. I am McKenna Raney-Gray. I use she, her pronouns. I'm with the ACLU of Mississippi as the LGBTQ staff attorney. And Vera, how can we get you on here? Cool. Yes, and this is
Hi.
Vera.
Sorry, I just shut my bedroom door. Hi, I'm Vara Lyons. I'm the Policy Counsel. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm at the Policy Council of the ACLU of Mississippi.
Cool. And Gus, I'm going to put you up here so you can introduce yourself, and then we'll pull you down until it's your turn. Ready to introduce yourself, Gus?
Yes, I am Gus Daniels Washington, and I'm happy to be here.
Cool. All right. Bye for now, Gus. All right. Vera, do you want to talk a little bit about what the ACLU of Mississippi is?
Yeah, so the ACLU nationally was founded in 1920 as a civil rights organization. We defend, litigate, and advocate for civil liberties based on the United States Constitution and Bill of Rights. We were started in Mississippi as an affiliate chapter in 1969 in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. We work on a lot of different issues here in Mississippi, including voting rights, reproductive rights, criminal justice reform, civil liberties, and LGBTQ issues. So we have a legal team, we have an advocacy and comms team, and we work throughout the state with various other progressive partners to basically make the state a better place.
Cool. And now I've learned how to advance the slides, so now we've got the voting webinar part. Vera, are you ready to jump into I guess I should kind of talk about what it is that we're doing. We've got some resources available online on our website for voting in general, and we've also got, as part of that voting guide, we've got resources for trans, non-binary, and gender nonconforming voters in advance of the election that's coming up in November. So we're going to go over some of those FAQs and talk about some of the situations that can arise when you're voting as a gender nonconforming person. So first off, we're going to talk about the general voting FAQs, and Vera, if you're ready, here's the first one.
Yeah, so as you all may know, Mississippi has some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country, according to a recent New York Times study. We are the second hardest state to vote in. We don't have online voter registration. We don't have early voting. And we are also one of only 3 states that impose a lifelong ban on voting for people who have been convicted of certain felonies that are enumerated in our 1890 Constitution. This is why one of the things I'm currently working on as Policy Counsel is a suffrage restoration project, whereby we're hoping to get people who have been convicted of these disenfranchising felonies through a process with the legislature to get their voting rights restored. So Mississippi is one of the states that does require a photo ID to vote. Most photo IDs are acceptable for voting, including a student photo ID issued by an accredited Mississippi University college or community college. So you could use your driver's license, you can use your passport, you can have a government employee ID card. You can also get, if you don't have one of those, you can also get a Mississippi voter identification card.
And I think we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So what if you have an expired ID that's otherwise applicable?
Yeah, as long as it's one of the acceptable forms of ID and it's no more than 10 years old, you can still use it.
Cool. And you were just talking about the Mississippi voter ID. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so the Mississippi voter identification card is free. You can get it at any circuit clerk's office. If you just Google your Mississippi County and circuit clerk's office, you should be able to find contact information and location to go to the circuit clerk's office to get it. If the next election is within 45 days of you applying for your voter identification card, you get a receipt for it, and you can use that as your photo ID when voting for the polls. Also, if you need a ride, here's the hotline number you can call, 1-844-Mississippi Voter. I believe that Lyft is also going to be offering discounted rides on the election day to the polls.
And we are in that 45-day window, right?
Yes, it is. If you haven't registered for the election, unfortunately, it is too late. As part of the really restrictive voting laws that we have, you have to register for an election to vote within 30 days. 30 days prior is the deadline to the election.
Got it. What if you are voting absentee? Do you need to show ID then?
So you don't have to show absentee at the post office if you're just mailing a ballot from wherever you're mailing it. But if you go in person to the circuit clerk's office, they will ask you to show an ID while you're filling out that absentee voter ballot.
Got it. So that may be a way for people who are worried about issues with presenting a voter ID if maybe they don't look like that. If you are able to vote by mail and send it off through the post office, that's one of the only ways that you don't have to show a photo ID, right?
Yeah, it might be a better option, a more comfortable option for you.
Cool. And what are the situations that you can use to vote by mail that way? Is it if you're out of town?
I believe that it's if you are if you are not going to be in town on the election date. So I know when I was in college in St. Louis, I voted absentee because I was not going to, even though I was a Mississippi resident, I was not going to physically be in the state on election day.
Got it. And same. All right, what if you get to the polls and you realize you either don't have any photo ID with you or you don't have any of the ones that are acceptable that we previously talked about?
So you can vote by an affidavit ballot, which is also referred to as a provisional ballot. It's a mechanism for voters who arrive at the polls on election day whose eligibility to vote is uncertain. Maybe your name isn't on the voter roll. Maybe you've moved and it somehow isn't updated in the system. They then go back and check your eligibility for that affidavit ballot. If you vote by affidavit ballot, you'll have 5 business days to come back to the circuit clerk's office and show an acceptable form of ID.
Got it. All right, and I think that's the end of our general voting FAQ section. If any of the viewers or guests had a question, we can pause just for a minute and see if anybody puts anything in the chat, and then we'll skip on to the next section. All right, we're going to scoot to the section on trans, trans plus just meaning transgender, non-binary, gender non-conforming, people who are under the trans umbrella voting questions. So some of these are the ones that I'm going to cover. What if I don't look like my photo ID anymore? In that situation, sorry. In that situation, you are not, as long as you're able to be identified by your photo ID, that should be an acceptable ID. That's really what the standard is. So if you have changed your hair or you've changed your presentation or you just generally don't look like your photo anymore, it's the same thing as if it's a 10-year-old photo and you can't really tell who this person is. As long as you can be identified by your photo, then it should not be a problem. So your clothing, your makeup, or your hairstyle being different are not valid reasons to deny a regular ballot. So the photo might be outdated, like I said, if it's a 10-year-old photo for any person, or if you have a different gender presentation, as long as the person looking at it can see this is the same person, which is really what an ID is intended to be for anyway, then that ID is valid for voting. Additionally, the poll workers are not supposed to ask questions about your medical history, your transition, your gender presentation. That personal information is not a prerequisite to be able to prove that you're allowed to vote. And if your gender marker is different, that's in the same category. It's just personal, private information that is not relevant to your ability to vote. So if a poll worker asks, why do you look like a woman, but your photo ID says that you're male, or vice versa, or any of the above combinations of that, that's simply not relevant for you to be able to vote. If you can be identified from your picture, you are qualified to vote. You don't need to. Another way to say that is you don't need to change your gender marker on your ID in order to be able to vote as that presentation. It also does not mean that it's invalid or fraudulent if you look different or have a different gender ID from your gender gender marker on your photo ID. And we might talk about this a little bit later when we bring Gus in, but if you've changed your name since you've registered to vote, you just need to make sure that the way that you appear on the voter roll, the way that your identification documents list you, and the way that you sign are all the same. So if you've changed your name or moved to a different address, you can update your voter registration online. I'm pretty sure that window has passed, the same as the application process for like applying to be a voter is 30 days before. So you can re-register in that county if you have just moved to a different place. If you, again, just make sure that everything that you do is all the same, so that your voter ID, it says ABC, you're in the rolls as ABC, and you sign the rolls as ABC. If you go through all of those steps and you talk to the poll worker and you say, as long as you can identify me from my photo, my gender marker doesn't matter. If they're still giving you issues from voting, we've got a poll worker card that's available online that you can hand to the person. It's available for download so that you can just kind of have it on your phone and show it to them, so that you can have some of that information delineated so that you're not required to be explaining it on your own behalf and by yourself. So that card is, like I said, available online. It talks about some of the same things that we're talking about here. So my advice would be, first start with that poll worker card, the little how-to card for them. And then if they're still having problems with that, it says on the document, and you can also tell them to call the election supervisor in order to get more information about that. If they're still having issues, you can contact the ACLU of Mississippi or the Election Protection Hotline. And then if they are flatly refusing for whatever reason, you can still fill out that affidavit ballot like we talked about before. That's the one where you have 5 days, within 5 business days afterwards, to go show an acceptable form of ID at the circuit clerk's office. Questions? And as a reminder, our larger voter guide, our midterm election voting guide, has some information and links about how you can find where it is that you would need to go. Like it has links for how you can find your nearest circuit clerk and things like that. Pausing for questions in case any pop up. All right, and Vera, I'm going to leave you up here, and I'm going to pull. There we go. There's Gus. Okay, Gus, you have generally the floor to talk about personal experiences and obstacles to voting. I'm going to let you talk for a little bit, as long as you want, and then I've got some questions we can follow up with.
Awesome. Trying to think of where where I should start. I think as far
a wide softball question is, what is your experience with voting in the past?
For the most part, voting for me has come at the expense of, I think my personal expression. I think voting days, I normally try to prepare myself to look as palatable as possible. Like I just always get myself into a function of like, oh, I can't necessarily be my authentic self. I just need to do this thing and then have as safe as an experience as possible, and then like leave, which is very interesting because I think that for most other people it's just like another day, but like when you are a vulnerable person group, you constantly have to prepare yourself for different types of experiences. So I think that when I go vote, I try to look as normal as possible, whatever that means, and I try to be as prepared for situations as possible, similar to this understanding of like having things to say, having ways to defend myself, having verbiage and language to advocate for myself, when I really should just be able to vote like everybody else. But it's definitely it's definitely a preparation and setup that I have to do while I participate in these spaces. So it's always like a getting it all together process.
That's a lot more like mental preparation than I've ever had to put in as a like cisgender female presenting person. So thank you for sharing that. What do you have a family connection to voting also that you'd like to talk about?
Yes, I have family members specifically from my like maternal side who work in like voter registration. Like they operate on the tech side and work on machines. So I've had a lot of access to voting opportunities, and I've even been a poll worker. And having someone in my family that works in voting has kept me somewhat safe because they can also advocate for me. But also in being a poll worker and going to other spaces of Mississippi that aren't Jackson, I've been exposed to other groups of people who were not happy that I was there, who was not happy to receive my services, and had a lot of questions about what I identified as, and whether or not I should have been, even granted the opportunity to serve them in that way. So I haven't been a poll worker in a long time because of those experiences. And I have been given the opportunity, but just for my safety, and because we live in a state that is so not ready or not willing to be more inclusive and more loving of like the more queer and fluid experience, I just have to keep myself out of those spaces because I don't think that I would be protected if I was to do those things again.
So it sounds like in addition to having some ways that we can protect gender nonconforming voters, it sounds like there's also a lot of room to be able to make it better for poll workers themselves and people who are in those spaces. For
sure. I think that because there's no such thing as like implicit care. So unless we're being intentional about providing language and training and situation practice where queer people are involved, we are really allowing people to determine for themselves what type of treatment they give queer people. And they can say, well, based on what I believe or what I know or what I feel, I think this person is deserving of this type of care. And that really can end up being dangerous for different people, especially queer people.
That makes sense. What is your situation with your ID document and where you're at in your name change? You want to talk about that?
I am changing my name this year and I've started the process. But one thing that I got told while doing my voter registration is that if I wanted to vote, I would have to vote under my dead name. And I was like, I really didn't understand that. And she was like, basically, because the election is November the 8th, you would have to keep the name that we have on file until at least then. So it was a little disheartening, and even like just prepare myself for that as well, to be dead named for like a full however long it takes for me to get through the voter process. I talked to her about like, oh, what if I could like get through it quicker, but just thinking about how long the process is in Mississippi itself, name change, it just wouldn't be done in enough time for me to comfortably vote under the name that I now go by.
Yeah, and that disparity between when our cutoff is, which is an arbitrary designation. That just means that your voting timeline and your name change timeline didn't sync up, and so you're going to have an experience that is less than affirming, just because Mississippi is designated that 30 days is how long you have to take before you can register to vote.
Yeah.
What are some of the strategies that you've thought about if somebody was going to give you a hard time when you're voting? And just as a reminder, there's something like 30% of people that are trans, non-binary, and gender non-conforming that experience some sort of issue or sticking point or discussion in order to be able to vote. So it's
for the most part, I just try to be as informed and have multiple forms of ID if possible. Thanks to you guys, there also is this poll worker thing that I definitely want to take advantage of if I have to. I try not to have to mention that I have people that work in voter registration because it's not up to them and I shouldn't need them to be treated well. But if it like gets just to the point to where I'm not being respected, I also have to be like, oh, well, I also know these people. But I think that also could go to the point of people just knowing who works for what and what people are related to what. I don't think you need somebody in your family to be able to know who you can have as an ally or a resource. So I just try to make sure that I know the people involved in my voter experience. So if I ever feel like, oh, I'm not being treated the best, I can be like, oh, well, I can go to this person and tell them, oh, I received this treatment. Very similar to like how on the document you guys said to go to like the supervisor of like the poll worker, like very similar to like just knowing the chain of command and being able to be like, okay, I know that I'm not being treated well. I know that there's another person I could talk to. I would like to talk to that other person.
Yeah, and it sounds like you're being very intentional about making sure that you have all of your ducks in a row. You know what it's going to be like, so you're planning for multiple different possibilities. I'm sorry that you have to put so much effort and thought into how you present and how you change your gender expression just to have a safer experience voting. And a lot of people are not able to do that. Some people might decide to boy mode just for the sake of being able to go out and vote, but there are plenty of people that don't want to do that or are not able to do that. And passing itself is a privilege, and trying to like tone down who you are in order to have a safer experience voting is really not how it should be. People should be able to voting as a right. It's one that we all have, and you should be able to do it without having any fear. But in order to try and have people give people resources so that they're not having to just do some of those things, that's why we put together the voter card and thing. So you do think that those might be useful for you and other people who are voting?
Yeah, I definitely think that they would be just like the information that's been put together so far. I read through it and I felt a little bit more prepared as a voter myself. And very similar to what you said, I have the privilege of sometimes being passing and people like adjusting me as female, and that being a little bit easier for me to get through certain barriers. But on the days that I am not as passing, like just having together those resources and being able to like have something that's printable and be like, yo, here's this as well. Like, I'm very aware that this isn't something that my voters experience should be dependent on. I think that that is so much more liberating until circumstances change and that's not necessary anymore. So I think that is definitely helpful and necessary as we transition from this heteronormative society that we're used to.
I agree. Is there anything in closing that is like, do you want to talk about why voting is important to you, or just anything generally uplifting about the voting experience that you want to pipe up with?
As far as generally uplifting, I think the only thing that like is somewhat encouraging is that our vote helps us to participate in changing the standards of care that we receive. And as a person who is queer, I take my vote very seriously because I want to see queer representation in spaces of decision making. And I also want to see policy that help me be my more authentic self. And that's something that we can only participate in certain ways, and voting is one of those ways. So I try to make sure that I'm in these spaces of decision making. And I know that it's intimidating, and I know that that's the reason why we're doing things like this, why we're making lives and doing webinars, is because it's really intimidating and it's uncomfortable and sometimes it's traumatic. And I don't think that people should have to force themselves through things that are like extremely uncomfortable. But if you have the ability and the courage to vote as a queer person, I say that is very necessary. So eventually we won't have to have, a day of preparation or a webinar. So we're doing the work now so we can not have to do it later. So I encourage anybody who is queer to really take advantage of the resources that we have and to have people available to be your allies and vote so we could eventually get these things changed.
Yeah, I've also heard that a lot of people will go as a group and vote, particularly since there's that you feel more secure if you're with other people, particularly queer or genderqueer people that are going with you, so you have some backup.
Yep.
I've also heard people say that voting is necessary, but it's not sufficient. So it's necessary to have our voices be heard and vote for people that are maybe more LGBT friendly or people who you think might have those policy interests at heart. But it's not sufficient. It's not the only thing you can do. So volunteering for you or doing anything like that are some ways to also get involved.
Exactly.
Right. Thank you, Gus. I think we're going to switch to our wrap up. I appreciate you being on here, and I always enjoy talking to you.
For sure. Thank you.
Okay, now, Vera. Well, I don't think we have any questions for Gus. These are some of the resources that we have, so that if you want to look up the midterm voting guide or our LGBTQ justice project, that's the work that I do. So we do litigation, education, and advocacy work in LGBTQ spaces. So I'm an attorney. We have legal aid clinics, and I have consultations with people about what their rights are. I will, if you're invited, I will go and give a know your rights training on whatever kind of LGBTQ topic you're interested in. And we also work on advocacy. So like teaming up and doing voting webinars when voting is not exactly my area, or seeing if we can make some positive change during the session that's coming up, the legislative session that's coming up in January of next year. So those, I think I've vamped and given you enough time to like look up the voting guide and the Justice Project if you want. So now, Vera, do you have anything to say about wrapping up talking about a voting plan and election day?
Yeah, so obviously make sure you have enough time and a plan to vote because we don't have early voting in Mississippi. The lines can get kind of long sometimes. So make sure you know how you're going to get to the polls. You can get a ride to the polls by calling that hotline we mentioned earlier. Lyft is also offering free and reduced rides. You also want to locate your polling place. If you go to the Mississippi Secretary of State's website, there is a website called Vote Y'all. And one of the links there, it locates your polling place. It'll also show you, when you locate your polling place, it'll show you a sample ballot of who is on the ballot. So you want to educate yourself about the candidates. There are some judges up for election this year, in addition to the congressional representatives. Shuwashki Young and Michael Guest, I know, are running against each other. I know in my district, we have the incumbent Court of Appeals judge running against a challenger. So just kind of educating yourself about who is on the ballot and who you'd like to vote for.
And resources on all of the things you just talked about are included in our voter guide, which again is there. I'm going to look up my sample ballot and make sure I have over the next 2.5 weeks until voting day on November 8th, I've got time to figure out who it is that I want to vote for. So if there are, yeah, go ahead.
And the last thing I wanted to remind everybody is do try to get to the polls early, but if you're in line by 7 p.m., you are still allowed to vote. So just make sure you make it to the polls.
Great. Okay. Well, I think that we've covered everything. Do you have any other plugs that you want to go into, Vera?
If we have any attorneys or law students who are watching, I'm currently working on a project pushing suffrage restoration for people who have been convicted of the disenfranchising felonies that I previously mentioned. My contact information is on the ACLU website. If you'd like to volunteer, get involved in that. We're working on having some clinics and information sessions about suffrage restoration and also expungement. So maybe you have a family member who has been affected or a friend. We have information on our website to get them to sign up and start the suffrage restoration process with us.
Got it. Okay. Well, appreciate it. Go vote. And Neely, help me with this. Oh, and broadcast. Bye.
Bye all. Thanks.